Story 1. One strong contender is Julius Caesar's friend Brutus, remembered forever as a traitor, even though he genuinely believed he was saving the Roman Republic from tyranny. Story 2. Any politician who has run against Alexander Lukashenko has lost. He has stolen the last 3 elections with a smile on his face. I do not know why they even hold elections in Belarus. Story 3. Probably President James A. Garfield. He was president of the United States for less than a year and spent 2 months slowly dying after being shot. I am only considering American politics here. Story 4. Alfred Dreyfus received an unfair trial from the French judicial system. Story 5. Matthias Erzberger had to announce to his country that Germany lost World War I. He was blamed for the loss, even though much of it was due to conservative generals who wanted total domination and victory rather than a peaceful solution. He was assassinated by 2 far-right individuals. Story 6. George Santos single-handedly brought the Panthers to the Stanley Cup, contributed to autism research in mountain gorillas, broke the land speed record in the Mojave Desert, can recite the lyrics to 50 national anthems in their native languages, and is also a passionate and caring partner. Story 7. Monica Lewinsky. Members of Congress, including Hillary Clinton, blamed her. This is a clear example of victim blaming and shaming. Story 8. Salvador Allende was wildly popular in Chile and advocated for a Chilean form of socialism. He began nationalizing the copper and banking industries, among others. He was assassinated in a United States-backed coup that put Augusto Pinochet in power. Story 9. I'm going to mention Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the only man in history whose death set off a chain reaction that led to millions of deaths. Story 10. Maybe not in all history, but Al Franken really got treated unfairly. One of the dumbest mistakes the Democratic Party ever made. Story 11. Maybe not the most, but Kerry and that swift boat nonsense. Remember the Band-Aids with the purple hearts on them? Those people. Story 12. Off the top of my head. H. Ross Perot. Both political parties ganged up on him, calling him stupid and a nut job. He was anything but stupid. His waffling on whether he was in or out of the race could be interpreted as crazy, but nobody goes to Washington, D.C. and comes out unscathed. They stalled and stalled on making him eligible for the presidential ballot in all 50 states, which basically undermined his campaign before it started. He was against the Gulf War, later on the Iraq War, and everything he said would happen with the North American Free Trade Agreement and our continued outsourcing of jobs happened. Most people think that Perot was just debating the Democrats, led by Bill Clinton, on that. But actually, the majority of the Republican Party was in on this, and the North American Free Trade Agreement and outsourcing of jobs were considered bipartisan. Story 13. Jimmy Carter was a good, decent man. They made him sell his peanut farm to avoid the appearance of impropriety. Now Donald Trump is setting up Bitcoin, hotels, golf courses, cell phones, citizenship for cash, and other ventures to launder hundreds of millions of dollars into his pockets, while the Republican Congress remains silent. We are a failed nation-state. Story 14. Al Gore won the 2000 election decisively. We would be in a very different timeline if Florida had not decided the outcome. Story 15. I would vote for Alan Turing. You can make a case that he saved the free world against the Nazis, and yet he was legally prosecuted and socially persecuted until he took his own life. Story 16. Morgan Tsvangirai, leader of the opposition party, the Movement for Democratic Change, to Robert Mugabe's ruling Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front Party in Zimbabwe. He fought tirelessly to free the country from the control of the racist dictator. When he won the 2008 election, Mugabe simply refused to step down. Eventually, South Africa offered to mediate, and their solution was for Mugabe to remain as president and Tsvangirai to become prime minister. He was arrested for treason and imprisoned, where he was tortured. He disclosed this to his wife during her visits to prison. She eventually died in a car accident with foul play heavily implied. His biography is well worth reading but quite tragic. There was much hope for Zimbabwe with him in leadership. He died of cancer in 2018. Story 17. Dean Howard was widely criticized for the Dean Scream. Interestingly, I was watching season 7 of Rick and Morty, and they include the Dean scream in one of the episodes, but it is very subtle. Story 18, Al Gore. Having the election handed to George W. Bush by his brother Jeb put us on a bad timeline. Can you imagine how much better climate change problems would be? How different the response to September 11th would have been, since he probably would have taken the intelligence about its possibility more seriously and would not have started a revenge war against countries that had nothing to do with it. Story 19. Jimmy Carter had bad timing. His efforts to get the United States out of Nixon's disaster and the oil embargo convinced Americans that Ronald Reagan and supply-side economics were genius. We are still paying the price. Story 20. Bernie Sanders would have prevented the most harm to the most common people but was extinguished by the ruling class before he had a chance. Story 21. At least 3 accounts have stated that they considered Donald Trump, the man who is currently serving his second term as President of the United States despite 0 previous actual experience in politics, to be the most wronged person in the history of politics. I consider myself fairly well-spoken, but I am honestly struggling to put my thoughts into words right now. Do people really consider a man who has ascended to the presidency twice to be treated that unfairly? Poor President Trump, how I pity thee. Story 22. If deception and propaganda are effective enough, we will never know. Mostly, those who have been wronged fade into obscurity while the perpetrators rise. Gross but true. Story 23. Al Franken comes to mind. The fact that most of the damage came from the excessive political correctness within his own party is the key point. Story 24. I'm not sure about ever, but Colin Powell was who came to mind for me. He was fed incorrect information and advocated for the invasion of Iraq at the United Nations. That pretty much ended any future political ambitions he had. Story 25. I am not an expert on the matter, but I believe Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her own bodyguards. One in particular had been with her for years, and she was advised to dismiss him when tensions between Hindus and Sikhs rose. She refused because she trusted him. This was a big mistake. Story 26. Former Speaker of the House Paul Ryan is notable. He was expected to be the young talent who would determine how the Republican Party would replace the Affordable Care Act after its repeal. He was the party's most promising prospect, with broad approval among the base in his 40s. There was a strong case that he would run for president one day. According to White House biographer Michael Wolff, a meeting was held to discuss the Republican Party's healthcare plan. Former President Donald Trump suggested that the government should pay for everyone's healthcare, which was an awkward moment. He endorsed the progressive left's healthcare for all idea, believing it was a novel concept he had created. The Republican Party never developed a healthcare plan but still moved to repeal the Affordable Care Act. It was saved by Senator John McCain, who voted against the bill and died soon after. This failure seemed too much for Paul Ryan and he retired. Trump severely damaged his political career. There was a major disagreement when Trump wanted to fire special counsel Robert Mueller, but Ryan refused to endorse it. American politics seemed within Ryan's reach until Trump was elected and publicly humiliated him so thoroughly that he completely retired from politics. Story 27. Arthur Pollin essentially designed and built the world's first electromechanical computer, a precursor to modern computers, based on an idea first promulgated by Lord Kelvin. The purpose of this invention was to make it easier for British capital ships to hit their targets. As Pollin was not a British naval officer, he needed liaison help to navigate the Admiralty's bureaucracy. A young lieutenant named Frederick Dreyer saw opportunity in Pollin's work and successfully convinced the Admiralty to elevate him from liaison officer to head of the Fire Control Systems Inspectorate. In this role, he soon copied Pollin's clock and sold it to the Admiralty as the Dreyer table. The Royal Navy outfitted almost every ship with the Dreyer table, making Frederick Dreyer both an admiral and a very wealthy man. Pollin sued the British government over this and won. His award of £30,000 was not enough to keep his company going, which effectively ceased to exist by 1918. Meanwhile, in 1917, the United States Navy sent Admiral William S. Sims to London to command United States Naval Forces Europe. A major part of Sim's command was a Navy technical mission tasked with examining British naval practice to identify its usefulness for U.S. interests. The British counterpart was headed by naval constructor Stanley Goodall. This group observed the British fleet during gunnery practice and noticed one ship consistently outperformed others. That ship was one of a few equipped with the pollen clock. The technical mission purchased several directly from the Royal Navy and shipped them home. The U.S. Navy employed Henry Ford to reverse engineer them. Ford then offered to develop a superior version. It took 2 decades of work, along with the invention of the transistor and the vacuum tube, but the project produced the Mark IA fire control computer, which became a key component in the now immortalized Mark 34 to 37 family of gunnery directors. These devices made the U.S. Navy the most accurate shooters in the world. The first attempts at missile fire control used a version of the Mark IA. Today, a solar-powered calculator contains more computing power. Arthur Pollen died in obscurity in 1937, though not in poverty. Dreyer received immense credit for his fire control work and also served heroically at sea. He died an admiral, a knight, and very wealthy in 1956. Story 28. Walerian Lukasinski has been in solitary confinement for 46 years. People go completely crazy after being there for 1 week. I don't think we understand how terrible solitary confinement is, so he is definitely the person who endured the longest. Story 29. The people of 1848 Germany experienced the German Revolution. The revolutionaries could not agree on what the new government should be and were subsequently defeated by the army and the nobility. Story 30. Jimmy Carter. Ronald Reagan secretly asked the Iranians not to release the hostages until he took office so he could run on the issue. After he won, the hostages were released. Iran was rewarded with an illegal arms deal. Story 31. I always thought Cassius and Brutus received an unfair deal for trying to save their republic from authoritarian rulers. Cassius is even depicted in the lowest circle of hell in Dante's Inferno for betraying Julius Caesar. Although Caesar was not a great person and was essentially the beginning of the end of the Republic, Cassius was right. Story 32. Larry Lessig comes to mind. He never really had a chance of winning but ran for United States president on an anti-corruption platform and was completely ignored by corporate media who pretended he did not exist. Despite meeting all qualifications for debates and primetime interviews, he was excluded from debates and neutralized by the media apparatus of both parties because he would have drawn attention to the corruption in both parties. Story 33. Benedict Arnold. The man was betrayed at every step by his compatriots, but it is his name we all associate with traitor. How many times do you expect to kick a dog before it bites back? You do not then blame the dog. Story 34. From an American perspective, one name leaps to mind and I will throw in an honorable mention at the end that may provoke strong reactions. Buckle in, kids. 1. Thomas Paine, a self-educated corset maker who became the voice of inspiration during the lowest part of the Revolutionary War. Only officially educated until he was 12, Thomas eventually made his way to the colonies in 1775 and became an employee of Benjamin Franklin. His 2 seminal works, Common Sense and The American Crisis, sparked the popular imagination for independence and kept the Continental Army from rebelling in the worst days of the war, respectively. John Adams praised Paine's work, saying, "Were it not for the pen of Paine, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain." The latter work arguably sealed the deal for American independence as it gave George Washington an opportunity to humanize the cost of the war and inspire soldiers with dreams of winning the struggle. Screwed over, in his later book, The Rights of Man, Paine argued that the elderly, children, and the sick or disabled should be given a stipend to prevent their slide into abject poverty. He advocated for equality of the sexes and for radical democracy, in which every man and woman, regardless of social standing or wealth, would be allowed to vote in elections. He also argued that families should be given a stipend when they give birth to or adopt a child to alleviate the cost of raising children. Paine decried land speculation and argued that any land beyond the original 13 colonies should be administered by a federal government. When he died, few attended his funeral, and none were founding fathers or closely related to them. He was buried near a tree, technically under it, not in a cemetery. A British supporter later dug up his bones to rebury Paine in his native England, but after 13 years, His bones disappeared and were never found. Paine inspired the revolution and kept it going, but angered the wealthy elites with his radical ideas, and so was ostracized by American society at large. Honorable mention, Benedict Arnold. A handsome, recklessly brave, ingenious, loyal fighter and true believer in the Revolutionary War, Arnold was disliked intensely by many in the Continental Congress. He was a cavalry officer who had been shot multiple times in the same leg and, by all accounts, should have died from sepsis or at least permanently lost the leg but survived nonetheless. A protege of George Washington but without the financial resources Washington had, he was impatient to be paid for his service because he had sold, pawned, or obtained loans against all his possessions to fund himself and his troops continuing to fight in the war. As a consolation, Arnold was given a position as governor of the newly reconquered city of Philadelphia. He was to marry Peggy Shippen, a secret loyalist, but after being repeatedly denied a field promotion by Congress, he was shipped off to West Point, separated from Peggy and seemingly sidelined. Screwed over, Arnold was deeply in debt by the time the British approached him. He was far away from the woman he loved, who had persuaded him to switch sides, and Congress had consistently denied him promotions he had earned as well as money owed to him. He had helped turn the tide at the Battle of Saratoga and was an exemplary officer by all accounts. When the British approached him, they offered the equivalent of $2.3 million to surrender the fort at West Point. From my point of view, after years of being underappreciated and stiffed financially, it is not surprising that Arnold, who was offered the rank of Brigadier General in the British Army, a promotion above what he would have received from Congress, turned against the very corrupt Congress that spoke of freedom with one face but consolidated their money and power with another. Story 35. Hillary Clinton. By far the most qualified and experienced politician of our generation, a sophisticated public relations campaign destroyed her reputation. We are all deeply hurt in ways we will never fully understand because she never became president. And whatever arguments someone makes against her, I do not want to hear them. Donald Trump's re-election unequivocally disproves any point made against her. Story 36. Al Franken was pushed to resign over a photo of pretending to grope a woman. Donald Trump has been found liable for actually sexually abusing a woman, credibly accused by multiple others. He bragged about walking into changing rooms full of underage girls in various states of undress, bragged about grabbing women by the genital area, and was elected to president twice. Story 37. Bernie Sanders in 2015, the Democratic Party gave Hillary Clinton the nomination even though he was more popular. He would have beaten Donald Trump in 2016. Story 38. Several examples come to mind. Christie, whose suspension is used on every single tank today, died a poor man after the army turned him down, then used it anyway. Nikola Tesla. Story 39. Maybe not the most recent United States politics, but the way Al Franken was treated by the Democrats is shameful. The Democrats always want to take the highest road and harm themselves. I am sick and tired of the when they go low, we go high mentality. The reality is when the Republican Party goes low, the Democrats need to jump into the gutter and confront them directly. Story 40. In the United States, Robert Bork may be a contender. The way he was treated even created a word in the dictionary. Borked. Story 41. Most disadvantaged, maybe not, but Bernie was treated unfairly by the Democratic Party, and he is still making moves. Story 42. Jeremy Corbyn, at least in the history of the United Kingdom, may not have been the best candidate for the time he ran and was not everyone's preference. However, he engaged the youth vote in a way never seen in living memory and was riding a huge wave of goodwill. Then his own party turned on him, and the press was even harsher because he was too anti-establishment. It is unclear how he would have performed in practice, but if his party had supported him and he had not been subjected to severe media attacks, he would have likely become prime minister. Story 43. Al Gore. I do not like him much, but the Supreme Court appointed by President George H.W. Bush violated the Constitution to overrule state election laws in the state where President George W. Bush's brother was governor. President George W. Bush won because the Supreme Court of the United States said they did not have time to follow the Constitution. Oops, I guess our friend's son is president now. Story 44. Bernie Sanders for what the Democratic elite did to him, and Jeremy Corbyn for facing criticism from every corner of the media elite with an anti-Semitic smear campaign that was also initiated by members of his own party. Story 45. Biden was a dedicated public servant his whole life and a loving father. He overcame a stutter, received the Medal of Freedom with distinction, and became president. As president, he had one of the most successful progressive terms in recent memory. However, it was more important to progressives to demean and laugh at him on The Daily Show for being old than it was to support him and unite as a party against fascism. Russia and foreign actors easily manipulated some Democrats into repeating every talking point they provided. Now he has cancer, and it is a difficult time for everyone. Story 46. Jimmy Carter. I knew as a child he was too good a man to be a politician. Just a great human being. Story 47. Geraldine Ferraro was brutally mocked as a vice presidential candidate simply for being a woman. She was the first female vice presidential candidate in United States history for a major party. Story 48. Richard Roos was boiled alive after being falsely accused of poisoning because King Henry VIII disliked a bishop. What an unfortunate fate to endure. Story 49. Jeremy Corbyn. The British establishment destroyed him and portrayed him as a rabid anti-Semite. He was probably the nicest person to ever hold that position of power, yet he was made out to be a Jew-hating racist. There were also many staff members in the Labour Party who actively worked not only to see the other party win the 2019 election, but also to support a conservative who they knew was completely unfit to govern at number 10. Their appointed candidate, Keir Starmer, then told blatant lies to Labour members to get elected as leader. Story 50. And Askew suffered horrendous torment and a ghastly execution because of King Henry VIII and his political machinations. Story 51. Allegra Stratton was the only person from the United Kingdom Conservative administration to lose their job because of the lockdown party scandal. She was not even at the parties. She was the press secretary who had to resign after a witch hunt when she made a joke about the parties during a press conference rehearsal. Story 52. Andrew Jackson was not a great person but was wronged nonetheless. Story 53. Ira Hayes is a tough one to beat. Not strictly a politician, but to say he got treated unfairly by the political system is an understatement. The German people at the end of the First World War would be another example. An exploitative treaty drove their country into a third world crisis because their people were scapegoated for a war caused by a Serbian terrorist. That is the definition of being mistreated by politics. Story 54. Nikita Khrushchev chose peace over war during the Cuba Missile Crisis. He backed down and withdrew the nuclear weapons from Cuba. A few months later, he went on vacation and returned to work only to realize he had been fired. He was given 2 houses and $1,000 a month as a retirement gift. Then, a few weeks later, the Soviets said, "Remember that house in the city? It's no longer yours. Also, you will only receive $400 a month." He lived in a small cottage for the rest of his days. His son said he was shattered and never the same after that day. He was considered eccentric, so it was difficult to feel sorry for him. Story 55. Mithridates of Pontus. His mother conspired against him with his brother and sister. He was forcibly married to his sister as revenge after some murders. Harried by the Romans and all his neighbors, he made himself poison-proof by taking small doses of poison. Eventually, he was captured and tried to commit suicide with poison. Instead, he was paraded in a Roman triumph and publicly executed. Story 56. Not a person, but the pig's head that Prime Minister David Cameron engaged with. Story 57. Theresa May took over from Boris Johnson. She had to make a Brexit deal. It was never going to happen, no matter who was in charge. She spent her whole life working for the public, then was treated unfairly when she finally got the big job. I may not agree with her or her party, but she was set up to fail from the start and did not deserve it. Story 58. President Ulysses S. Grant. A good president who was too humble to embellish his memoirs, so his memory and legacy were destroyed by lost cause supporters for over a century. He was also repeatedly betrayed by appointees he thought were good people but turned out to be corrupt. At the opposite end of the spectrum is Mexican President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who deserved his fate. Story 59. Exactly the same question as this posted 7 hours earlier. Story 60. Since the agricultural revolution, individuals have been highly disadvantaged in terms of property ownership. We can discuss specific names all we want, but ultimately, no one was more oppressed than serfs and slaves throughout human history. Story 61. Here is a fact not many people know. William R. Anderson of Tennessee. A Navy veteran and author, Anderson ran for governor when the state was still dominated by segregationist Democrats. He outperformed the Republicans but could not win the governorship. 2 years later, he ran for an open seat in Congress as a Democrat. He was a forward-thinking representative and was even considered a potential vice president. However, after the 1972 census, the state party gerrymandered his district, and he lost the next election. Story 62. Joe Clark prepared a budget that his party requested, but they voted against it. This ended his government within months. Story 63. Nixon definitely deserved being treated unfairly, but he took all the blame for the corruption deeply rooted in his entire party back then. He was the scapegoat for the Republican Party. Story 64. The brothers DeWitt. Johann DeWitt was a decent statesman, but unfortunately, the country was attacked from 3 separate sides unprovoked. An angry mob decided to kill the president and his brother for some reason and eat their body parts. Even though the brother was not politically involved, he was blamed as well. I feel like it was mostly an excuse for royalists to revert to a king instead of a president, which is unfortunate. Otherwise, we could have been one of the oldest democracies. Story 65. Thomas Sankara is one example of a very wronged person. The most wronged? I doubt anyone could possibly say. Story 66. Definitely Cicero. He tried hard to save the Roman Republic, was exiled, came back, fought against corruption, and ended up having his head and hands chopped off and displayed in the Forum. Worst retirement plan ever. Story 67. Howard Dean was on a roll but became a little too passionate in a speech and people turned against him. I often wonder if he is upset with what the American public will accept these days. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.